My name is Gianna Ritchie, and I am the Assistant Librarian for Public Services here at the Frick Art Reference Library. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Digital Art History Lab's final lecture of the Spring 2019 season, titled Artist Archives Initiative, New Research Models for Contemporary Artists. Our speakers today are Deena Engel and Glenn Wharton. Deena Engel is a clinical professor in the Department of Computer Science at the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences of New York University, as well as the director of the program in Digital Humanities and Social Science at NYU. She teaches undergraduate computer science courses on web and database technologies, as well as courses for undergraduate and graduate students in the digital humanities and the arts. Deena also continues her research and collaboration with a number of museums on the conservation of time-based media and software-based art. Glenn Wharton is currently on faculty in the Museum Studies program at New York University. From 2007 to 2013, he served as media conservator at the Museum of Modern Art, and in 2006, he founded Voices in Contemporary Art, or VOCA, a nonprofit organization focusing on the production, presentation, and preservation of contemporary art. This fall, Glenn will leave NYU to become a professor of art history at UCLA and will become chair of the UCLA and Getty program in the conservation of archaeological and ethnographic materials. Together, Deena and Glenn co-direct the Artist Archives Initiative at NYU. Please join me in welcoming them tonight.
Thank you, Gianna. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful sunny afternoon. Deena and I are going to play a bit of a tag team, so we'll be running up and down the stairs, switching every once in a while. But I would like to begin by just saying that Deena and I have been working together for a number of years on various collaborations, starting when I was at MoMA and continuing through today. We collaborate very well. In fact, we just taught together in a class at NYU the other day on collaboration, and we spoke about our collaborations, but the value of people working together who are in different disciplines, either at universities or museums and universities. We've done this in various formats, and we not only believe in collaborative work across disciplines, but working with students, with graduate students and undergraduates to help them learn and expand. So as you'll see in the project that we'll be discussing today, we've really tried to employ that in various ways. So before I begin with the slides about this project, I just wanted to set the stage a little bit and tell you about my work at MoMA as media conservator. I was there from 2005 to 2013. And I had been a sculpture conservator before that and an archaeological conservator before that. When I arrived at MoMA, working with media art, installation art, and later performance art, the kind of work that I did as a conservator really shifted from cleaning and repairing and shepherding things through time and place into the future to building institutional capacity to reinstall these works in the future or reperform these works in the future. And that meant documentation. So I and my colleagues at MoMA were doing new kinds of work for me, asking artists to fill out questionnaires about their work, interviewing artists, creating floor plans, creating installation manuals, making videos of performance works to create all of this information that future generations of conservators, curators, installers could come back to once we're all gone. So it was a really different form of conservation and a real rethinking about what conservation meant. And working with living artists, of course, had new challenges and opportunities. So I thought I would start with a few slides just to give you an idea of the kind of work that I was doing. One project was to work with Matthew Barney and his studio to bring works in to MoMA. They were actually co-acquired with a Schaulager in Switzerland. And we had to figure out how, in the future, to install these works. So I worked with him and his studio, his staff, to build installation manuals. seems very prosaic, but in fact it was pretty profound to have to think through, well, what are the core essential elements of these works as they shift and change over time to retain their identity. So we had to, first of all, just on a material basis, get a list of materials that he had used in creating some of these works. Some of them were media installations, some of them were sculptures, some were interactive. And the sources for supplies in case they need to be replaced in the future, but also floor plans, and just step by step how to install these works. And they hadn't done that in the studio, so I really did need to work together with them and make photographs of the works and create these manuals. And I also worked closely with him, and we interviewed him and others in his studio several times. This is an interview with two curators from MoMA and the Schaulager. Again, just getting this sense from him of what these works are and how he would like the public to experience them. So this was new territory for me. I'd been used to cleaning and repairing traditional sculptures and objects, and I really loved it. When we started acquiring performance works in 2008, we were all scratching our heads about first, what does this even mean for a museum to acquire performance works? And in this case, we were acquiring works produced in the 2000s, so not happenings from the 60s and 70s, but performance works that were being sold in edition, just like prints and drawings and sculpture. So the artist would make an edition of, say, 5, and the museum could buy 1 of 5, 2 of 5. But what we were actually buying were the rights to re-perform these works. So there was no tangible thing that we were acquiring, aside from maybe the contract and some documents describing what these works were. So this shifted our work even further to think, okay, we need to do interviews. Let's start with interviewing the artist. What is this performance? What should people wear? What should their training be? What kind of room should it be in? What should the light levels be? Should there be other works in the room? And once you start thinking about it, and then each work was very different. So we would ask different questions. We would make a video of the artist performing the work. This is Roman Ondak right here with Measuring the Universe, which is a work where the performers approach people in the gallery and say, "May I measure you?" And if somebody says yes, then they back them up on a wall, draw a horizontal line, write their first name and the date they were born, and essentially, just like our moms did as we were growing up, essentially developing this black line around the gallery wall, which reflected the average height of the museum visitor. But then for him, we had questions about, well, what do we do if there's a window? What do we do if there's a column in the room? What kind of a marker should we use? So we videoed him performing the work, we videoed him training other people to perform the work, and then we videoed other people performing the work and really got a sense of, for him, what this work could and should be, and prepared all this documentation for future staff. So with that, one more. So this is another performance work by Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla. It consists of a piano with a hole cut in the middle, meaning that there are missing strings. And the pianist stands inside of the piano and leans over and plays Beethoven upside down and backwards, while rolling the piano around on the floor. So there's casters on the bottom of the piano. You can imagine the kind of questions I had for them. Well, who should these performers be? It turns out they should be classical pianists. They need to really be able to play Beethoven and obviously be interested in doing this. At a certain point, I said, well, can they just roll the piano around anywhere? And they said, oh, no, we've developed charts and diagrams for each different performer. And I said, well, could we have those? And he said, yes, of course. So he sent them to us. And it turns out he had drawn these little diagrams for each different performer on how to roll the piano around in MoMA's atrium. So we have that now, or MoMA has that. a set of itineraries for, at least for MoMA's atrium, where that piano can be moved around. So you can see we were getting into very new territory here for conservation documentation. When I left MoMA in 2013, in order to be more proactive in my own research and writing, I wanted to continue this work, and I wanted to continue my collaboration with Deena Engel one way or the other. So she and I sat down and discussed, well, what could we do? And we realized that it would be really interesting to continue building information about artists, but in this case, what we would do is create information resources about individual artists. So we would do all that kind of research that I, and actually she was joining me in at MoMA for SoftwareWorks, but do it on our own. And instead of creating information for museum staff, we would be creating information for the public. So these resources that we're creating are for the public, for curators, conservators, critics, art historians. So when I say the public, I think it's probably going to be the public that would actually use this information to learn how to exhibit and how to conserve the works. We started with David Wojnarowicz, who was an artist active in Lower Manhattan in the 80s, 90s. He died in 1992 from complications due to HIV/AIDS. He was an activist as well as a very multidisciplinary artist. So he did photography, videos, films, installations. He was a writer, collages, and he was also an activist. He was one of the lead AIDS or ACT UP activists towards the end. And he was a very engaging artist, and his papers were at NYU. And that was key, that we had access to them. This is one of the sort of key works that he created, and you don't have time to read the whole thing now, but it's very powerful about his life as a gay man and the injustices he felt and or experienced, and him towards the end living with HIV and the difficulties with that. So it's very tough stuff. We got meager grants, first from NYU and from various sources, to hire graduate students to go through these papers. So they went through his notebooks, which are at Bobe's Library in Fales, special collections, and scanned them, researched them, and you can see that there's a lot of information there that could really help a curator, conservator, art historian, critic, because these were ideas he had for creating his works. Some of them were manifested, some not, but they're fantastic research tools. We also went through all publications about his work. We went through other archives, and there weren't just papers, but there were films and objects, all kinds of things in the papers at NYU that we could go through. So graduate students from different departments did all of this research. We interviewed a number of people, in this case, the artist Sir Rodney Sir. This is Diana Cameron, who is a PhD student in media and communications, asking him about his work with David Wojnarowicz back in the 80s. And here they are looking at an image of an installation on her laptop, and that kind of triggered his memory. Oh yes, we did this thing together, and David was very concerned about the placement of these objects. So the interviews were really helpful, and we did a number of them, so they're now up on this resource. But let me just, before Deena comes up, tell you about what we later came to call the database challenge. And it was that standard collections management databases in museums, as Deena will discuss, are hierarchical. And so the fields are set. You can't put more than one set of information in a single field. And the kind of knowledge that we were creating was really complex with multiple linkages. And so I just have a few examples. This is the magic box, which was found under his bed when he died. It was full of all kinds of little plastic toys and things that were all symbolic of his work. So it now has been exhibited. So it's an exhibitable object. But these objects all have different relationships. So some appeared in his photographs and films, videos, installations, and we wanted to be able to create a resource where people would be able to find those relationships. In this case on the right, it's a photograph where he was traveling with a friend who is an artist. He said, "Stop the car, I've got an idea." He went out, dug a hole, buried himself in it, and he said, "Please take a photograph of me." So the question, and it's now an iconic image. It was at the Whitney retrospective. So the question is here, who's the author? It's been attributed to him, to her, and to both of them in the literature. We interviewed her, and she said, "I'm absolutely not the author of that photograph. He set it up, he told me what to do, he directed it, and yeah, I snapped the photograph, but I was not the author." So that was good to know, and we featured that information in the knowledge base. But then how do we feature it in a database? So he's the artist, but she had a very special relationship with the production of that work. And just one more example. This is a papier-mâché shark that he used. It's been exhibited on its own, but it also appeared in an installation that he created. So how do we call that? How do we, what attribution do we give that within the database? So I'm sure if any of you out there have dealt with these kinds of information management decisions about developing controlled vocabularies and creating resources, I'm sure you've come up with these kinds of problems for any data set, but it gets very complicated with this form of art. So one more image. This diagram was created by one of the students working with us, Francisco Chaparro, who's a PhD student at the IFA. And so he was doing a lot of this research, and we asked him to try to conceptualize some of the problems we were facing, and he drew this diagram, and we all just looked at it and said, "That's it." I mean, it looks like a mess, right? And don't try to figure it out. But what he was trying to do here is decenter the artist and decenter the artwork and feature the linkages between the people, the places, the things. So just as Marian Skimama is related to that artwork, we could draw a line from people to him and people to photographs, say, or just, the places, maybe the place where that photograph was taken. So all of these different relationships, we wanted to develop a resource that would allow users to find this information and these relationships. So this is the problem that we posed to Deena, and I'll let her take it from there.
Thank you, Glenn. So, traditional physical works of art privilege a highly structured database. For example, a Dutch master painting, other similar paintings, we would probably want to track the artist, title, medium, dimensions, perhaps some keywords on the subject, a year or approximate year, a description, and much more. All of this information would go into strictly defined data fields in our database. It is cumbersome and time-consuming to modify the structure of such a structured database like this, and so, on the technology side, we are very careful to define all of the fields that we need as much as possible upfront and to regularize the data as best we can to meet these standards. In this way, we support discoverability. So, for example, we could search for all the oil paintings by Rembrandt or the still lifes in a collection that were painted in a given year, watercolors that have not been framed, and so forth. We also use controlled vocabularies to support these endeavors in discoverability. A controlled vocabulary, a list of agreed upon terms or definitions, is often rendered in a graphical user interface in a computer system as a drop-down box that only allows for valid entries. So here, for example, the medium could be oil on canvas, that would be part of a controlled vocabulary. And I'm sure some, if not many of you, are familiar with the vocabularies that the Getty has published for many years. But there is a cost to this kind of database structure when we are working in cultural heritage. Identifying the kinds of information that we deem important to track about every artwork and doing so within a fixed structure is in and of itself an act of interpretation. The metadata are the information that we want to store about each object in our collection. But as this art historian argues, the digitizing, organizing, and devising of metadata are always acts of interpretation, the product of a set of decisions that carry interpretive inflection. They are not neutral or value-free, and each one privileges one aspect of a digital artwork, a digital artifact, at the expense of others. So we need to think very carefully about how we build our databases for works of art, especially for contemporary art. Some museums are opening their databases to the public for study. Here we see two tables in the database from the Museum of Modern Art, which are posted, this is the New York MoMA, which are posted on the popular website GitHub. In this example, we have two tables, one for works of art and the other for artists. So in this structured database, we can separate out biographical information about an artist from technical details and information about each painting or work of art. This way, we can avoid repetition of the artist details with every work of art. And yet notice that this particular excerpt of the model implies that each painting or work of art has one artist or a primary artist. And this is an assumption that is not necessarily true throughout Western art or non-Western art. We cannot always assume that. And yet it is part of, in this particular case, part of the data structure. A traditional database, and here I'm talking about databases about art, would build out these structures to strive to capture the information on the artworks and the context. But again, here looking at Omeka, which is a system designed primarily for archival materials and traditional physical works of art, the tables are fairly standard from a technological perspective. The problem that Glenn and I pose is how do we work with variable media art, installation art, and other works of contemporary art that do not fit this model? So we started in collaboration, my computer science students and I, we started in collaboration with our art history and humanities members of the team to develop research goals. We want to capture the complexity of the artworks. We want to capture the complexity of the relationships, both among the objects, as you saw with the Wojnarowicz, an object can be both a sculpture in its own right and a component of an installation, as well as the relationships among the collaborators. We wanted to design a system with an easy-to-use interface. We care very much about the long-term preservation of the resource itself, of the digital resources that we are preparing. Low development and maintenance costs are very important throughout cultural heritage research and database work. And we wanted to build a model that can be readily shared with others wanting to create similar resources. So from these goals that we agreed on with our humanities members of the team, my students and I then developed 7 systems requirements that would help drive our software decisions. We first wanted to make sure that we use software that will support what is called a directed graph model. A directed graph model in computer science is a way of designating relationships among entities, whether objects, people, and so forth. We would need user authentication so that we, as we develop the software, could provide an appropriate points of entry for scholars who might be editing the site, people who would just be reading the site, administrators who would have responsibility for access to the site. We made a commitment to open source software, as this is an academic research project and also one in cultural heritage, that therefore we also wanted to make sure that our system would require only standard maintenance. For example, we could custom build a system that would maybe be ideal for this particular implementation, but then maintenance going forward could be very difficult and expensive. For research purposes, we want to make sure that however this work, our system would work, that we would be supporting extensive discoverability and many pathways to the information. Clear navigation so that our users would always know where they are in the system and how to find what they're looking for, and to provide the underlying technological support for the controlled vocabularies. So once we had these goals and also our requirements in mind, we started looking at software options. We looked at, these are some of the many frameworks that we looked at for developing a customized system to work with these research materials. We also looked into a number of collection management systems. Omeka, as I mentioned, is a wonderful system in many ways, but it is very much developed for physical materials. Archival materials would not work at that time, for sure, with the kinds of materials we have. Collection Space is an open source collection management system that was still very new when we were looking. And some of you may be familiar with Gallery Systems. That's the TMS, the museum system, which is proprietary and therefore would not meet our open source standard. After a fair amount of testing, we settled on MediaWiki, which is the software that underlies Wikipedia. After doing a beta, so after trying these many other systems, we then did a beta test with MediaWiki and decided that that would be how we would move forward. We were able to confirm with the scholars we worked with and for ourselves that MediaWiki supports all of the goals for the project and continues to meet our technology requirements for developing a model. It is indeed open source. There is a very strong user community for MediaWiki, partly because of Wikipedia for sure. There is a very active developer community for Wikipedia, so we knew we wouldn't be kind of left stranded. MediaWiki supports the extensive use of configuration, meaning that we could set up the software with parameters external to the actual source code that would determine how the software would run. This translates into lower maintenance cost and putting us in a much more secure position to be for long-term preservation of the site, because we did not need to do custom programming, which at various points was a disappointment for my students who love to roll up their sleeves and program. There's also a shallow learning curve for our users because everybody's been on Wikipedia at some point. In terms of discoverability, we wanted to make sure that our users would have many different pathways to quickly and easily find the information they are looking for, as well as to have the opportunity to browse the site. For example, many people are comfortable with a hierarchical menu. So this is one entry point into the system that offers a number of different ways to go, a number of different paths. MediaWiki also supports lateral searches and page linking. So text searches were particularly important for us because what we did was we got transcriptions for all of the audio interviews. The audio interviews, some of them were very long, certainly longer than an hour, which are wonderful if that's what you would like to listen to. By all means, we'd love for our users to listen to the interviews. But in fact, if what you want to do is learn about how to handle the conservation of stencils, then the text indexing that we did on the transcriptions of the interviews would allow discoverability of that material, so then you'd have the option to read or listen to it. MediaWiki also supports highly descriptive URLs. So we also noted in some of our user groups that people were coming up with how to find things by just going to the URL, and where it said works on paper, they would put stencils, or they would put works on paper / stencils and find works that way as well. As we developed our model, shared with our colleagues, we also have seen that other institutions are looking at working with wiki software, generally configured very differently than ours, but we're always happy to share our work. In order to rely on that underlying graph and the power of a wiki software, and SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, is now working and developing with MediaWiki as a hub for curated information for some of their complex artworks.
So the David Wojnarowicz knowledge base is now launched. It's out there. There are people using it, people researching it, people contributing to it. And we turned our heads now to our second information resource, our second artist. We selected Jonas, who is an artist who I had worked with at MoMA before, so I knew her. We discussed her work and thought that it would offer an appropriate challenge for us. We approached her. Some of you may know she's in her 80s now. She's really at the top of her career. She travels around the world all the time, so she's very busy. But she's also thinking about her legacy. And when we suggested this possibility of creating an information resource about her work for curators, conservators, critics, art historians, and others, she jumped on the chance, and she was very, very supportive. And has been very supportive over the last year and a half of us working with this. So once again, we got funding, meager funding to hire graduate students. This is just the stand-in page on our WordPress site right now because we're developing it out. So as we speak, we have a team of 7 people. There's 3 partners, Deena and I, and just as we partnered with Marvin Taylor for the David Wojnarowicz knowledge base, we've partnered with Barbara Clausen, who is a Jonas art historian and curator, and also knows her personally for this project. So our graduate students are now going into her loft in Soho where she lives, and she's opened up her archives. Her archives are cardboard boxes in her loft where she also lives and works. So we're scanning her notebooks. This is Brandon Ng, again at the IFA, who interviewed her. We now have other students who are interviewing her. We're interviewing other people. We're going through all the publications. Same work that we did for David Wojnarowicz. It's different because she's alive, and she's going to be very involved in determining the aesthetics of the knowledge base that we produce, and providing us access to people who she thinks we should interview. So it's a very different kind of project having the artists involved, which we're very pleased with. And I'd just like to point out that the challenges that we had for David Wojnarowicz were one thing. The challenges that we're facing with an artist who creates installations and performance works is a whole other thing. Because not only are the installations different every time, but they involve human beings, the performances, and these are two iterations of installation works that she created. It's the same work, but because of the interpretive quality, different museums have displayed them differently. And she's very involved every time her works are displayed, but she won't be with us forever. So that's really the purpose of our resource, to guide curators and others to make interpretive decisions in the future. But also her work, she thinks of one work as kind of unfolding and expanding over time, so it manifests in very different ways. And this was a whole new concept for me, to think of one work, say, Mirage here, or Organic Honey, which has been going on for decades. It might be shown as a single-channel video. It might be shown as an installation with objects and multiple videos. There may be performative elements to it. Some of the monitors and screens actually have her performing. So it's very complicated, and once again, one of our graduate students came up with a diagram. This is Organic Honey, and what he's done is mapped out all of the installations of Organic Honey over the years. Actually, these aren't even all of them, but tried to circle the relationships between them because of the elements they have. So once again, I ask you not to try to figure it out, but just on a conceptual level, see that it is very complicated. And just as we had proposed to Deena help with these, the very nature of the work that we were dealing with and the information we were producing because of the multiple linkages of information, now please help us with iterative works that are, it's the same work, but it's very different every time it's performed. And so I'm very excited to say that Deena and her CS team are coming up with whole new solutions for creating the resource for us.
Oops, did I go the wrong way? So for this project, we're starting with a WordPress site as a portal into the project. And this site will host narrative, images, and audio. Using WordPress will allow us more flexibility in our presentation with colors and fonts and other aspects of web presentation than a wiki, and will just constitute this one part of the project that is mostly focused on narrative. We are researching the use of linked data for this project. So using linked data is in contrast to the highly structured database that you saw earlier, and is also in contrast with the kind of underlying graph of categories and subcategories that we use with wiki software. We are concerned here, as Glenn mentioned, with aspects of the artwork like iterations and the nature of performance art that does not lend itself to the databases that we saw earlier. In terms of linked data, one could think of linked data as a combination. One way to think of linked data is subject, predicate, object. So for example, here, Jonas, the subject, predicate, she was born, object would be in New York City. Jonas received an award, so object, subject, and predicate, from the Guggenheim. She has works in the collection of National Gallery of Art. She has works in the collection of the Tate. And the way linked data works is that then the relationships can be defined. So we could say one particular work is an iteration of, and that's then its relationship to another work. We also can use any of the subjects and the objects as a launching point. So what else is exhibited at the Tate? What are her works at the Tate? What are her other awards? Who else got Guggenheim Foundation fellowships, and so forth? So We can define the relationships in the subject and object in a variety of ways. We're researching the possibilities that linked data will give us the flexibility that we need to capture important information about performance art throughout its development and presentation. There are a number of cultural heritage institutions now working with linked data, institutions as diverse as Rhizome here in New York City, part of the New Museum, and the Getty Research Institute in LA. We have been invited to participate in ongoing development of a collection management system called Research Space. This is a Mellon-funded project which is run out of the British Museum. We had a workshop scheduled with them tomorrow, but I think now maybe it's later next week. But in any case, do stay tuned as we and many others in the field are looking to see the appropriate and best practices for using linked data and linked open data in cultural heritage studies, such as contemporary art. Sure.
A few more slides, and then we'll open it up for questions. So just so you know, these knowledge bases, once we put them out there in the world, we hope that people will continue to contribute to them. So the David Wojnarowicz knowledge base, for instance, is managed by an archivist at Fales Downtown Library, or Fales Special Collections at NYU. And we're part of a team, an advisory team. So if anybody, unlike Wikipedia, where just anyone can, submit anything, we are controlling it. But we encourage students and researchers to continue to make contributions, and we as the advisory team would review a contribution, maybe even work with the person who put it together to make it more helpful, but we've already been receiving some, and so we're putting up there, so it's very much alive. For dissemination, we're trying to communicate our work as much as possible, not so that other people will come to us necessarily, but to put these models out there. The idea is that we feel that there's a need in the world for creating information resources about artists. They don't even have to be contemporary art. They can be any artist or school of art. So we're publishing articles, we're holding symposia. This was our first symposia when we launched the David Wojnarowicz Knowledge Base, and we're communicating in lectures like this, but we're going to academic conferences and encouraging our students to publish and communicate as well. And this was our second symposium last year, where instead of having David Wojnarowicz scholars talk about the importance of his work and discussing the resource we were putting out, we invited archivists, curators, conservators, and others who create information resources about artists in different environments, for artist foundations, for museums, for archives, to talk about the kind of work that they do. And we even had an artist there who talked about archiving the work of her mother, who was an artist. And we'd just like to acknowledge our all of the support we've been getting, mainly from very small NYU grants. We do now have a grant from a private individual, Suzanne Deal Booth, which has been really helpful. They've paid for our symposia and helped us pay for all of the graduate students that we've been working with, and some of the undergraduate computer science monitors. Or computer science students. As I mentioned, Marvin Taylor and Barbara Clausen have been our co-directors on the two projects so far. And many thanks to all of the students we work with. It would take about 5 more slides to list all of them. They're all listed on our website and in our publications, but they're just represented by students right now. And that's it. So contact us if you've got any questions. We really look forward to any questions that you have now. We could continue going, I'm sure, but I think it might be more interesting to open it up at this point. So. We do have mics here also, so.
I had a question. I was wondering, are you linking is there...
Hold on. I think this is being recorded, so if you don't mind, it'd be great if you could speak into a mic.
Since NYU has the papers for David, I'm not going to try and pronounce his last name, and then you also have the knowledge base, are you linking to each of are those interlinked, or?
Do you want to answer?
So there is some interlinking, yes, that there are references in the knowledge base that go directly to directly into the finding aid and directly to the archival materials, as well as sort of an overview of what's in the archive and a general link to the archive. Yeah.
But we are thinking that it could be a model for, the Fales Downtown Collection are collecting papers of artists who lived and worked in downtown New York in the 1980s and 90s, and so they have a number of these collections now, and we would love it if they or other archives that are collecting artist papers would create models like this. And we asked ourselves quite a few times, what is it that we're creating here? Because it's clearly not an archive, so you might even say that the Artist Archives Initiative is a little bit of a misnomer, but somehow the Artist Knowledge Base Initiative didn't quite sound as sexy, so we decided to call it the Artist Archives Initiative. So we're not creating archives, obviously. We're also not creating finding aids. So a finding aid, if you ask an archivist, is as neutral as possible of a resource that will allow users to research the archive. So it's often just box-level description. We've got these boxes, these are the numbers of the boxes, and this is what the box contains. We're doing a little bit more than that, or maybe a lot more than that. We're providing researchers with information that's one step up. We're trying to be neutral, so we're still trying to just put information out there for others to discover and use for their own research and publication. But we've done a lot of that basic research, so we're going beyond what an archive typically does.
I also wanted to add that there are links to some conservation reports as well, and I've gotten feedback that that's also very helpful.
I had a sort of follow-up question to that. Sorry for the other person, but what is the process if another artist archive, let's say at NYU or another artist outside, wanted to use what you've developed? How does that work?
You can answer that.
Can you use the mic, Deena, a little?
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Very straightforward. So this has happened, and we're very, we want to make sure that everything is open source. So my students and I documented the configuration file, all of the details about how we installed MediaWiki to support this kind of work, the types of software we use. There is also a page on the wiki specifically with all of the with a lot of technical information, exactly what software we use to complement it and so forth, and we're more than happy to share.
Thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering, I know that this hasn't been available for all that long, but I was wondering if you could discuss in a little bit more detail the type of feedback you're getting from researchers or the archivists at Fales. Is it helping to focus people's research? Is it driving more traffic to the archives? Is it changing who your researcher is?
Well, I can say, first of all, we're not tracking the number of users. We're just very few people here, very busy doing other things. So we've put it out there, but we are getting good feedback. We're getting students, a lot of graduate students who are finding it, using it, and sending us questions, maybe writing papers on David Wojnarowicz. What's interesting, one of the reasons why Marvin Taylor suggested that we work with Wojnarowicz was that he not only was not so well known, Marvin just really felt that he was an important artist that wasn't known that well. But the Whitney Museum had decided to create the first David Wojnarowicz retrospective, which happened last year. And since then, I understand there's a surge of interest in David Wojnarowicz, so the timing was good. We are getting good feedback, but we're not really monitoring or really even like advertising it. It would be nice if well, Fails is very committed to making Wojnarowicz known to the world, and we're hoping with Jonas to identify a organization that will, take this on. It could just be Fails once again, because they're very interested, but if there was some organization that we felt that we could trust to manage the resource in the future, we would hand it over, but still be behind the scenes helping with technical issues.
Thank you.
I have another question. Sort of also on that theme of sustainability, not only long-term sustainability, but also just of the advisory board. So when people have things, you said that it's curated. You look at what people have suggested, but what happens in 40 years?
We talk about that a lot. Do you want to answer that? Or? Okay.
I thought about the software part. You talked about the people part.
Okay. We're very much aware of that we won't be here forever. So we are identifying institutions which we think are very stable. And in this case, for Wojnarowicz, it's definitely NYU, and it's definitely going to be managed there through the special collections and the archives at NYU. They're committed to it. So the current archivist who's on staff there, as I said, is the manager. It will probably be handed down to the next manager. So on the people part, I feel like we're taken care of, that we now have this advisory team, and if any of us needs to cycle off, we'll ask other people to come in with a balance of technical expertise and expertise on David Wojnarowicz, curatorial, and conservation. But yeah, if you want to talk about the technical aspect.
I think from a technical aspect, we were very much looking for software that would have a very strong user and developer base. And because we're using the software that is the basis of Wikipedia, Wikipedia is not going anywhere anytime soon. And when it does eventually migrate somewhere, there will be a lot of material to migrate, and we anticipate that at that point, there will be lots of developers writing the tools to do so. So, and it requires very little maintenance, really just operating system upgrades and backing up and the normal stuff that would happen for something sitting on a server.
I'd like to just add that we're being a little adventurous for us, thinking about working with research space, because it's not fully developed software. It's a current version is out there. They're working on a new version. But Deena and her team have been doing a lot of research on linked database software, and she could speak to this more, but she hasn't been finding any. So as she said, we're going to be having a couple of workshops with them to see if we want to pilot a case for the Jonas knowledge base, because it is such exciting software, and it has so much potential to do what we feel needs to be done with Jonas's work. Yet, we're creating this WordPress site, which again is very stable software. So we might even create pages that are not open to the public, because that information is going to be on the research space site. But if that ever goes down, then we could open those pages up. And WordPress, we feel, is very stable software.
Yeah, there are some very exciting initiatives happening in cultural heritage generally and in contemporary art in particular. I mentioned Rhizome. My computer science student and I participated in a symposium there in the fall that was very exciting. But this is all still fairly cutting edge, and the software is not readily available. And in order to run queries right now against linked open data, it requires a good deal of technical skill. So we're looking to, it'll be fascinating over the next few years to see what kind of user interfaces are developed. So
The Frick is starting a project using research space software with photo archives around, and Pharos. I don't know if you've heard of it, so
yeah.
we're all kind of trying it.
Yeah.
so much potential.
Can you, or would it be a good idea to link to something like Panopticon, which is software specifically for the development of catalogs raisonnés, both hard copies and online catalogs raisonnés?
I'm not aware of that software, but do you?
Yeah, I haven't used it, but I've heard about it. Again, our concern is that since we're not building a catalog raisonné or an archive, we want to really explore database options and database structures that are very, very flexible, and that will allow us to really point more to research materials, not just information about the works of art. So, as I say, we didn't look at Panopticon. I think I'm familiar. I think I know which one that is. We did look at collection management software, but we have the option to do something.
It's going to stay separate from any catalog raisonné initiative.
I'm sorry?
You're going to keep your project separate.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when I was saying before, when we were trying to articulate quite what it was we were doing, and we said we're not an archive, we're not creating finding aids, we also said we're not doing a catalog raisonné, because we're not exhaustive. We just don't have the time to do the research at the level that we're doing. So we're trying to, like with Joan Jonas, we've selected two very important works, Mirage and Organic Honey, to go really deep on. And we've selected two retrospective exhibitions, one at the Stedelijk Museum and one in Barcelona, to go really deep on. And then we're going to provide descriptions of other retrospective exhibitions. So we're not trying to be exhaustive. We're hoping people will develop these resources more in the future.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.